You are taking a live look over the Israel-Gaza border as the Hamas terror group's Rafah brigade has been destroyed, with more than 2,300 of its fighters killed by Israeli troops. The Israel Defense Forces saying troops also destroyed more than 8 miles of tunnels. A lot to discuss out of the Middle East. So I do want to bring in Jonathan Tobin, a friend of the show. He is an editor-in-chief there at the Jewish News Syndicate. Thank you so much, as always, for taking the time to join us here.
Great to be with you.
All right, so first off, the big question as we hear that the Rafah brigade has been taken down, destroyed there, according to the IDF, how significant is that brigade when you're talking about Hamas as a whole?
Well, when you consider that the whole discussion about the war just a few months ago was the effort by the Biden administration and Vice President Harris to prevent Israel from going into Rafah, which was the last enclave in Gaza, which the Israel Defense Forces hadn't yet taken, and where the last fully operational brigade of Hamas's armed forces, its army, was located. And what has happened in the last few months, despite the predictions of doom and gloom and mass casualties and horror, the IDF went in there methodically, having learned a lot of the lessons from the early months of the war, and therefore was able to convincingly and really decisively defeat Hamas's forces there, killing and capturing so many of them, knocking out a lot of their enclaves in the tunnels, and basically making it no longer operational, which isn't to say that there aren't some scattered groups hiding in tunnels and seeking to escape elsewhere. But as an armed force, it's finished. And this was accomplished without the mass casualties, without the catastrophe and humanitarian catastrophe that was predicted. This is a triumph for the IDF, and it illustrates that Hamas can be defeated. It's not just an idea that can survive despite everything. It's terrorists can be killed, they can be captured, they can be rooted out of their holes, at a cost, but necessary if Israel is going to prevent more October 7th style massacres by this genocidal terrorist group.
And from one brigade to another here, the former commander of Hamas's Khan Yunis brigade apparently wrote to Yahya Sinwar and his brother, and he was pretty much begging for help, saying that only 25% of the brigade's fighters did remain. Now, Israel's defense minister Yoav Gallant saying that Israel gathered that information from a document that troops recovered prior to the death of that commander in an Israeli airstrike back in July. So my question for you here overall is, how big of a dent does this make? Because we're talking, of course, about the Rafah brigade, but then we're also talking that the Khan Yunis brigade has been kind of dwindled down as well.
Yeah, I think Hamas's armed forces haven't just been decimated. They have been largely destroyed. Now, they are still operational in the sense as scattered guerrillas. They can pop up, they can, create havoc, intimidate the local Palestinian population, steal the food that is sent in there to aid the population. They haven't completely disappeared, but the notion that there was no way that Israel could accomplish any of this was a myth. And it shows that the IDF was not the sort of paper lion that was depicted in much of the the U.S. press in recent months, saying that the war had been a complete failure, that Hamas was largely untouched. That's just not true.
We heard from Israel's chief negotiator for hostages and missing persons, Gal Hirsch, who had mentioned proposing offering Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar safe passage out of Gaza in exchange for the 101 hostages that do remain there, taken, of course, on October 7th, nearly 1 year ago. Do you think that is a real possibility? Is that something that Israel would agree to?
I think if Hamas was prepared to release all of the remaining hostages, not just a few, not just sprinkled out over time, if they were willing to release all of them, or all the bodies, because we don't really think that 101 people are still alive in their hands, then I think Israel would be prepared to grant Sinwar, his escape. I think they'd be willing to grant a lot in order to get that. But that's not on offer. Hamas has never agreed to anything like that. Sinwar hasn't agreed to anything like that. And the reason for that is clear. Hamas's strategy to win this war, in which they've really been, battered by Israel's armed forces, they no longer control any large area inside Gaza, has been to simply hold out for Sinwar to stay alive, stay out of Israeli hands, to hold on to some of the hostages, to have some people under arms, until the day when they hope the United States will force, as Vice President Harris said in the debate with Trump this week, to accept a ceasefire immediately. If they're still under arms in any numbers, if Sinwar is in Gaza and alive and free, unless at the time of a ceasefire, then Sinwar wins in his eyes. Hamas wins. That Israel will not have, even after nearly a year of warfare, to have completely eradicated them or prevented them from reconstituting themselves in time and taking the Gaza Strip back over. That is their strategy, to survive in any numbers, under any circumstances, until the West and the United States basically delivers Israel to them on a silver platter. That's always been their hope. And all of the demonstrations, all of the slurs and smears about Israel, all of the press coverage claiming that Israel can't win, Hamas can't be defeated. That's what they're all aiming at. That's what feeds that belief. So I, for one, believe that is why they have rejected all ceasefire offers, all of which have been quite generous, all of which, if they were really just looking for an escape and an end to the war and an end to the suffering of their own people, which they have maximized, they would have taken any number of those offers. So this latest idea of just, letting Sinwar out is not something that I believe they're likely to do, because that's not their objective. Sinwar's objective is not, to go to a comfortable exile in Qatar with the rest of the Hamas cutthroats. His idea is to remain in place on the day that the end of the war is forced on Israel. That will be a victory for Hamas. That will doom the Palestinians, quite frankly, to more generations of war, and doom any moderates, to the extent that there actually are any among the Palestinians, to defeat, because Hamas will then claim, we won, we are the true voice of the Palestinian people. That's why calls for an immediate ceasefire are so counterproductive for any hope of eventual peace.
On that same note, what's interesting is we did hear from the leader of Hamas, not Yahya Sinwar, but one of the other lesser leaders there, that Hamas is, quote, ready to implement the ceasefire deal that was brought forward several months ago by President Biden. We know that Netanyahu has said that he pretty much agrees to that as well. So if Hamas was really agreeing to that, wouldn't we have a deal reached by now?
Yeah, we would have had a deal reached months ago. But of course, that's not what they want, as I just said. They keep stringing this out because they know, and it's true within Israel, that the domestic opposition to Netanyahu, coupled with the concern for the remaining hostages, are willing to blame Netanyahu for the lack of peace, even though he agrees to these deals, and Hamas says no, because they can get at Netanyahu. He's vulnerable to them. There's nothing they can do to pressure Hamas, or they don't think. Now, the United States has ways of pressuring Hamas, because the United States can pressure Hamas's friends and enablers abroad, like Qatar, which is, sort of a treacherous U.S. Partner at times. But he hasn't done that. All the pressure has been on Israel and Netanyahu to make concessions to end the war, when the only way to end the war is forcing Hamas to admit defeat. And that they're not willing to do yet, as long as even a few of them are left alive. And that's the problem. And that's why the hostages haven't been released. That's why the war continues, because Hamas believes it can fight until victory. And they interpret victory as the day that the United States forces a ceasefire on Israel.
It's been about a week since a Turkish-American protester there in the West Bank who was protesting the Israeli settlements was killed. And the IDF did investigate. They said that it was an accidental situation. Just a few days ago, President Biden came out with an official statement, and it pretty much said that he was outraged. He did use the term outrage there. Do you think that the death of that Turkish-American protester could potentially cause any issues between the U.S. and Israel as the war does reach the 1 year mark?
Well, I think it's just one more sort of club with which to beat Israel. Obviously, that was a tragic death. It was an accident. It wasn't intended. But when people place themselves in harm's way in the middle of armed conflict, the terrorism on the West Bank has been increasing because that's Hamas's strategy. They've tried, although they failed, to create a second front against Israel, in Judea and Samaria. Attacks on Jews in that area have increased. Violence, a lot of people, have been killed, largely due to the fact that Hamas and its supporters are trying to step up the pressure on Israel to surrender. That doesn't mean that death was justified, as the Israelis said. It was an accident. But let's understand what happened here. It wasn't as if they targeted this person and sought them out. That person sought out conflict and tragically, got, as happens sometimes to journalists, members of our profession, we go in harm's way, and sometimes, whether intended or not, when you go where the bullets are flying, sometimes the bullets hit you, because that's where the news is. If you're a protester, if you're someone who's an enemy of Israel and trying to create, a confrontation, the same consequences can happen. That doesn't mean, it is not to be regretted, and that wasn't, a mistake, but that's what happens when you stick yourself in the middle of an armed conflict.
And before I let you go here, I do want to talk about the fact that we are approaching the 1 year mark of the attack on October 7th by Hamas on Israel that led to the Gaza war here. When all of this did happen on October 7th, did you think that a year later, this is where we'd be?
Well, I can't say that I did. I don't know that anybody could have predicted the course of the war. I did not think it would be over in a few days or a few weeks. I knew that it would be a long, laborious process to root Hamas out, because that was the objective. Hamas had spent 16 years digging itself into Gaza, created a tunnel system larger than the New York subway system, in which it hid itself, hostages, arms, leaving civilians to face the brunt of the war. But I did not think it would take this long. And largely because I did not anticipate, probably, like a lot of people, we can't predict the future, that the efforts of the United States government, to sort of hamstring Israel's forces, to prevent it from going all out immediately and acting swiftly, would place such obstacles in the IDF's way. I also perhaps underestimated the difficulties that the IDF itself had, and this is a sort of a subject for postmortems within Israel and within the Israeli army itself. I don't think they were prepared for this kind of war, even though this was an obvious possible scenario that they had to face. I don't think they were at all prepared. I think it took them months to figure out how best to fight it. And as we began talking about its success in Rafah, this is the opposite of sort of what happened in the opening weeks of its offensive to get Gaza. They had to learn, as armies often do. Think of American history, about the American army in World War II and other conflicts. It often takes more than a couple of battles for an army to figure out how to fight successfully. I think the IDF was unprepared, just as it was unprepared for the surprise attack on October 7th, which was a disgrace. I think it was unprepared for this kind of war. It's now gotten better at it, and I think we've seen that success. But this is the situation that this is for future historians to unravel. But I think that's partly the reason why it's taken so long. U.S. pressure, foreign pressure on Israel and on Netanyahu, as well as the IDF's own learning curve.
All right. Jonathan Tobin, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to join us and break down the latest. Anything else you want to add about any of this before I let you go?
Well, I think that the bottom line here is that efforts to pressure Israel to stop the war immediately, to focus on, with false charges of genocide, have just prolonged the war, prolonged the suffering for all peoples in the Middle East. The only way to end that suffering is to get rid of Hamas, as I said, a genocidal terrorist movement that is dedicated to continuing Palestinian suffering in order to achieve its goal of destroying Israel and the genocide of Israelis. The more Israel is allowed to fight this war and fight it to a finish, the sooner the suffering will end.
All right, Jonathan, as always, thank you so much for taking the time to be here with us. We appreciate it.
Thank you.